Hi there, I'm Philip Ideson, the founder of Art of Procurement. And at Art of Procurement, we help procurement professionals like you plan and deliver change with confidence. Whether it's through the mapping and prioritization of your change journey, securing the subject matter expertise that you need to help you along the way, or assisting you and your team to take action on what they learn, and what's really important is on also what they already know. And of course, a big part of what we do is this weekly podcast where we share strategies and tactics that aim to inspire and help elevate your change journey. I want to thank you for joining me today. Let's go straight into the show. Hi everybody, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement. And this week we're doing something a little bit different. It's actually a reprisal of a type of show called This Month in Procurement that I recorded a few episodes of about 18 months ago, I would say it was. And I was chatting with my often collaborator and now director of content for Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. And Kelly and I thought, let's go and do This Month in Procurement and have it be a conversation between the two of us. So today I'm joined, and I have to make sure that I don't treat this as an interview and that it's really a two-way conversation. But I'm joined by Kelly. So Kelly Barner, welcome to the Art of Procurement.
Thanks, Phil. Don't worry, I'll keep you honest because I'm going to fall back into interviewer mode too.
Please do, because you need to make sure that I don't end up taking over and just take the easy job of asking the questions and put the hard work of answering them all on you.
No, otherwise I'd have to stick a bill in the mail.
Yeah. And so for anybody who doesn't know Kelly, and I'm sure that most of you who are listening do, Kelly has such a broad background across procurement. So starting as a practitioner, working as a consultant, and then for the last 10 years, running Buyer's Meeting Point. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about Buyer's Meeting Point for those that haven't come across you, and I'm sure that's very few and far between across the Art of Procurement audience.
Sure. So the idea of Buyer's Meeting Point is really about two things. It's about knowledge and it's about networking. Mm-hmm. So on the knowledge front, it's covering webinars, events, bringing news stories from a procurement perspective to a procurement audience, and bringing general business stories in and kind of discussing them given the challenges and opportunities that procurement is focused on. But it's also about networking. We've been on social media very strongly almost from the start, and whether that's Twitter or whether it's a carefully managed LinkedIn group that isn't full of a bunch of spam, mm-hmm. We're all very lucky today to be in a world where it's so easy to connect, and yet that doesn't always mean that the right information finds its way to the right person. So that's always been sort of the goal around education and development and connectivity in terms of what Buyer's Meeting Point provides to a procurement and supply chain practitioner audience.
One of the things I love as well is kind of that looking outside of procurement. It's something we always try and do, and we're not always successful, but looking for best practices outside and seeing what we can learn from. I know that's something that you're pretty passionate about.
It is something, and I'm reading constantly. I mean, my primary way I spend my time, I guess, is writing, but you can't write if you don't spend maybe twice as long reading. And in fact, I always think back to that, I'm going to date myself, that old Tootsie Roll commercial where everywhere I look, I think I see everything becomes a Tootsie Roll to me. I sort of go through the world, whether I'm in the Boston area, so whether I'm reading Boston news, I work with ISM New York, whether it's New York news, economics, mm-hmm. general sort of business finance coverage. I try to always read these general news stories and then think about, okay, what does this mean to someone in procurement? Because if we just keep talking our way around the same loop inside the same bubble, that is definitely not the way to get any new ideas or come up with new approaches and ways of doing things.
Right. No, it's often easier said than done to look at the outside and bring new things into procurement because, they're not tested, some of the things that we're talking about within the procurement space. And we do like to, I think, stick with what we're comfortable with. But I do love to kind of challenge ourselves. And often there's things that are working outside of procurement that it doesn't take much adaptation and contextualization for procurement to put those into practice. But again, it's just opening the mindset, I think, to seeing that we can try new things. Just because it's not invented here.
Absolutely.
So what we want to do with this month in procurement is, first of all, just have a discussion about the previous month's podcast. So, I'm often recording these podcasts and obviously publish them every week, and the interviews go out there every week. Never really have the opportunity to give some commentary on what I thought or some of the things that I learned. And likewise, Kelly is doing a lot behind the scenes in helping me in the publication of those podcasts. So we thought it might be interesting just to share some of our behind the scenes thoughts on each one of the podcasts in a particular month. We also wanted to look at if there's any news stories that have caught the eye over the last few weeks and just share some perspectives that we may have on those. And obviously invite alternative viewpoints from yourself as well. We'd love to hear from you as you're listening to this and maybe have a different opinion on some of the things that we talk about, because for us it's all about opening a conversation as opposed to it just being Kelly and I sharing what we think of the world. And then we want to focus on a particular topic for the month. And that may be something that we're interested in sharing about. It may be bringing in a guest for more of a roundtable discussion. Or what we're looking at doing as well is starting some kind of category expert series where Kelly and I will have a chat with a category expert just to learn what's going on in a particular space at any point in time. But anything else, Kelly, you think we want to cover in these shows?
I think one of the goals is it's one thing to look at the podcast. It's another thing to consider the news. And then, of course, there's this idea of whether it's an expert or a topic that we're interested in. But it's amazing, even as I was preparing to have this conversation, and, once a month seems frequent, yet you look back over all the content and you think, oh my gosh, we've covered so much over the last 4 weeks. It's amazing the connections between these things that start to emerge. And you didn't even necessarily see them because when you're going through one component at a time, you see each podcast or news story or topic for what it is as a standalone thing. But then you kind of look back at all of it at once and you realize, oh my gosh, this conversation is an example of that topic, or this news story absolutely references back to what this person shared in their interview. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting opportunities to find cross points between the news, the topics, the interviews, practitioner points of view. I think that compare and contrast is going to be one of the interesting things that'll come out of these monthly reviews.
Yeah, and a question that brings up for me, and it's probably putting you on the spot a little bit because we didn't talk about this earlier. There's so much content. You mentioned content going by, and we're obviously creating a lot of content as well. One of the things I struggle with, and I actually wrote about this in our annual letter. I used to do the This Week in Procurement newsletter, where there's a lot of links to different stories every week, and kind of figuring out how can I re-energize that, because I found that there's so much of the content that's out there. It isn't necessarily moving the needle forward, if you know what I mean, moving the conversation forward. So I just wonder how you go about kind of finding the content that is actually interesting and relevant for you in a way that doesn't feel like it's overwhelming, because it's easy to just say, oh, so much out there, it all sounds the same, I'm not even going to engage in anything.
I think it's funny. This is one of the things, and part of my background is a focus on market research, for the sake of supply market intelligence. And a lot of times, Jeanette Jones and I, who wrote a book on this, we actually talk about how much more work as a reader you have to do now that so much content is available for free. And we usually talk about it in the context of ensuring that the content is vetted, right, that it's quality, that it's reliable before you start sharing it and maybe even making business decisions on it. But in this case, it's instead of thinking about it from the perspective of should the enterprise invest money in this supplier or should we approach this market in a certain way based on this article, it's about the investment of your own time. because there is so little time. And in fact, one of the things, this comes out of one of this month's podcasts, Joanna Martinez talked about the fact that nobody has any time, but everyone has 5 minutes somewhere. And how are you going to spend your 5 minutes? So if 5 minutes is your as yet to be made investment, what one article, one blog post, what piece of one podcast are you going to listen to? And for me, it always comes down to who wrote it. What's the perspective of the author? Why did they write it? Is it a thinly veiled commercial? Is it someone pouring out their soul on a topic? Are they promoting themselves? Are they just plain sharing for the sake of knowledge exchange? And then, truthfully, maybe this is selfish, but I expect a little value in what I'm reading. So if I look at something, it has to impart information and it has to make me think. But if I can tell from the title, from the first paragraph, even sometimes from the graphic or the picture or the visual that's going along with it, if the author invested a little bit of extra razzle dazzle, that I can see it that quickly, I know that they've also invested their own energy, their own thought capital into making that resource worthwhile. So I'm sort of a try it and abandon it quickly type of reader. I'm more likely to go into a lot of articles, get 1-2 paragraphs in, go, this is a rehashing, or oops, advertisement, right? And then you bail, and not sink a bunch of time. And maybe I'll poke my nose into 10 or 12 things and only read one of them front to back. But I still get the benefit of knowing the one I read front to back was absolutely worth my time if it could hold my attention. But the little pieces of information that you pick up about who's writing about what phrases come up repeatedly, even in something that's more marketing oriented, that's important too for monitoring and noticing trends. So that's sort of my approach to reading, because as much as that's maybe what I consider a larger percentage of my job than the average practitioner, I still only have so much time to give to it. And so that you're absolutely right. There's way more content than any of us can actually read. But it's, you have to wade through a lot to find the thing that's worth your time.
Yeah. I find myself doing the same, actually. I book some time out of my calendar and as much as I could try and keep myself disciplined to keeping that time. And do something similar. So I have a lot of RSS feeds that will pull articles into a single database. So I have a single place to go where I can go and look at them rather than having to go and look at a variety of different sites. But I find that it is the same. You can click on something. I do a quick scroll. I basically look at the first paragraph and the last paragraph, and that tells me if there's any ulterior motive behind the article, and if the top paragraph and the bottom paragraph seems safe and it's a topic that's of interest, then I feel it's worth the time to invest in it. Yeah,
to wade all the way through.
Exactly. So you mentioned Joanna Martinez's podcast on the art of procurement, which was actually, we're recording this the 22nd of January, so it was actually yesterday's podcast. So let's go there and just have a chat about the pods this month. I wonder if you could just share some of your thoughts around the conversation that I had with Joanna.
Yeah, so it's funny, and I'm looking at my notes, and honestly, this is truly the way I look at things. I look at things both broadly and in terms of the immediate context at all times. It actually says right in my notes, Roadhouse, the old movie about bartenders at a really rowdy bar. And if you've ever met Joanna or listened to her speak or read her book, A Guide to Positive Disruption, that will probably be very jarring because there is no one less like a rowdy bar bouncer that I've ever met than Joanna. But she makes a really interesting point. She doesn't dodge how complicated it is to be competitive and to get ahead in today's talent marketplace. But one of the things that she really insists upon is not only maintaining a positive attitude, but being constructive and collaborative in all of your relationships. And how that, to me, ties back to this idea of Roadhouse is when they were training all the new bartenders and bouncers in this place, they would say, if someone's causing trouble, walk them to the door, but be nice. Mm-hmm. And then if they push back and they try to tussle with you, show them the way out, but be nice. And it's one of those things that as procurement becomes more and more hard hitting, I think in terms of the types of projects that we're working on and the approaches that we're taking, we have to be more confident and not necessarily pushier, but maybe firmer in some cases. But we have to be nice because all of the relationships, and whether it's supplier relationships or whether it's the type of relationships that we heard about in the podcast on working with millennials and Gen Z, there's all different types of personalities that we're all going to interact with on a regular basis. And in order to accomplish anything, we need to have positive relationships with all these kinds of people over the long term. We can no longer say, okay, I got to get through this, so I'm going to beat up this supplier, but then they're going to be forced to be nice to me tomorrow because they want to keep the contract. It doesn't work that way anymore. We're trying to be customers of choice. And so I think at the end of the day, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the millennials and Gen Z, because that's such a huge topic. But it really comes back to the people issue again and again, regardless of what we're talking about.
Yeah, ultimately, I always talk about human-to-human relationships because that's what we're in. We're in the business of these relationships. And, I mean, that's true, even though, we're supporting our organizations and our corporations and business, B2B, business to business. Well, it's not really. I think it might have been Bertrand Maltaverni who talked about human to human.
Yes.
And it's just so true that everything we do has a personal edge to it. And I think that when I think back to some of my supplier relationships as an example, especially earlier in my career when I was in the automotive space, you just saw those as being disposable. That it was all about getting the deal. It's about winning. It was a zero-sum game. And I'm kind of ashamed about some of those relationships and how I managed them earlier in my career, because you didn't really, relationships were collateral damage because it was all about getting what you wanted and getting it now. And it's easy to take that view, especially even today, it's easy to take that view when you're dealing with what maybe something that's a little bit more commoditized, because at the end of the day, it is the numbers that matter. But I think we do lose sight of the fact that every single time that we talk to somebody, we're representing the brand of our employer or the organization that we work for. And so we can be the greatest salesman and brand builder for our companies, or we can really do a lot of damage in the way that we communicate with people.
And even beyond the company, I mean, talent even internally is more transient than it used to be. Yeah. It's no longer, I'm in procurement, and so I will be in procurement at this company until they give me my gold watch and I retire. It's today I'm in procurement, tomorrow I might be in operations or marketing, or maybe today I'm in this business unit and tomorrow I'm in that business unit. I think things are a little bit more fluid, and that just increases the pace with which either our good behavior or our bad behavior will come back to either reward us or kick us.
And you mentioned about the podcast that I had at the beginning of the month with Charlotte de Brabandt and Yannick Blattler. I think it was the longest, that won the award for the longest episode title that I've ever had. But ultimately it was about how to work with millennial and Gen Z colleagues to really help them be successful, and obviously them being the future of the profession. And I hesitate here because one of the things I always struggle with is giving people labels and stereotyping. And that's what the show obviously does when it talks about millennial and Gen Z colleagues. I think it's more of a representative of age ranges as opposed to labels. But I think so much of any individual that we work with, it's about mindset. It's not about what label we give them. And because you can have somebody who is more mature in their career, but they have the same mindset as somebody who's in the early stages of their career. So just because of their experience level, their age, their backgrounds, whatever it may be, it's dangerous to kind of pigeonhole them or stereotype them in a certain way.
Well, it may come right out in that conversation and talk about the fact that for those of us, Phil, it's depressing. I think you and I count as older workers, but assuming, let's just say not millennial, right?
Yeah. I think you've just had your birthday and I haven't had mine yet. So we're just in that slight period. Where
Yeah, that's right. We're having a golden podcast here. No, but the idea that when you're working with someone that, older or younger, right? When somebody is in a different generation, a different age group, a different experience level than you have to sort of separate the behaviors, and let's include in that speech and communications, right? Because we can prove it's happened. So their behaviors, their communication style, consciously separating that from their mindset, because it's not the same thing. And yet we so often have a tendency to respond to the behavior, respond to the words, respond to the speech, when really it's the mindset. Teasing ahead, I think we're going to get into this around this month's topic. Yeah. But when you can focus on someone else's mindset, it's a much more effective way to understand where they're coming from, what's important to them, what they're worried about, what they're working towards. And you can connect with them on a deeper level than if you focus on their behaviors, their words, and then you assume what the mindset was that motivated those things.
Yeah, one of the things it does pull out for me is for those of us who have been in the profession for a little bit longer than a millennial or a Gen Z who's coming into procurement, is that there's an onus on us to unlearn a lot of what we believe to be true. So we believe a number of things to be true. And, I wrote that series in the Future of Sourcing magazine about looking at things that we take for granted that we need to challenge ourselves, whether they're actually true or not, whether they're fundamental truths or not. Because we're brought up in to believe certain things to be true, and actually they may not be. And that may be things like, I don't know, that an RFP is something we should use every time we want to go to market, to the fact that a stakeholder is really trying to do everything they can to avoid working with us. That perhaps it's in the value that we place in our technical skills versus some of those behavioral skills. And that's the harder thing. I think if as a professional, we're able to, having had the experience or having had more experience in the profession, if you're able to recognize that you need to unlearn things to then learn new ways of doing things, I mean, that's huge. I think in terms of when you look forward to making an impact and changing how you work. And, those are some of the things that are obviously a built-in advantage for those that are coming in to the profession now because they don't have that baggage.
Absolutely. And to tell you the truth, I mean, the more interaction we have with people from different companies, industries, age groups, functional teams, the better, because hopefully we have an environment where someone can come to us and say, I noticed we always do X. Why do we do that? Mm-hmm. And if you can find yourself answering that question with some variation of, because that's the way we do it here, that's a red flag. This is something that needs to be reconsidered. Yeah. And it's not necessarily something to overthrow. Maybe it's the best possible way to do whatever that is. But doing something because this is the way we've always done it, it's not a reason anymore.
Now, the third podcast that we haven't touched on yet was with Sarah Scudder, and I interviewed Sarah at SIG, which was back in October timeframe, I think it was, and we were talking about the print category and also taking risks within your career. I just wonder if you could share some of your takeaways from that one.
Sure. So there were actually two things that I took away from Sarah's podcast, and one of them actually really caught me by surprise. I've always been sort of a believer in the idea that as long as you were working with the right experts and you knew how to do some research, that process expertise was more important, generally speaking, than category expertise. Mm-hmm. That if you were really, really good at being constructive and cost modeling and research and reading and had good internal SMEs and some decent incumbent suppliers to work with, like I could be doing LTL freight today and I could be doing toner cartridges tomorrow and then I could be doing armored guard services the day after that. And, that at the end of the day, like that's going to work out okay. But Sarah is so dedicated to marketing and print that I think for some categories, it was a good reminder for me that there are areas, not only in terms of the industry itself, where it becomes sort of a cultural world unto itself, where you have to stay immersed in that, but also Depending on how reliant your company is upon that category of spend and how maturely you've managed it, you can't take this like, wow, I know how to run a 6-step sourcing process, and so I can do, however complicated this category of spend is. That actually, I haven't thought about that in a long time. And I appreciated her perspective on that.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, you think about how do you make an impact with your stakeholder or with a prospective stakeholder the first time you go and talk to them. And I've heard it so many times on the show from different CPOs, how you really need to be showing up, immediately adding value because you can share information or you can share perspectives that the stakeholder didn't have before. And that's the point that they see you as being, more than somebody who is here to help them run a process. You're here as a business partner. You're here as somebody who can advise them because you understand their business. And it's something that we sometimes get away from when we're more generalists. And I say that from a position that's where I dedicated my career, on the practitioner side to being a generalist, to being able to help anybody, whatever they spend, to add value, whether that's save money, whether it's look at innovative ways of, bringing new products or new services in or new business models. But it also, I would always have to learn the industry and learn the business. And that's okay if if you give me a category and say, I'm going to be responsible for, let's say, the HR benefits category, and that's all I'm going to be responsible for, then I can learn all the ins and outs of that and become an expert. But when you're touching multiple categories and you're only touching something once every 2 or 3 years, it becomes really difficult to be able to bring the value if you don't have access to some expertise in a category by doing it on your own because you just don't have the bandwidth to become an expert in everything or even to be semi-intelligent in a particular category.
Especially when you're talking to the people inside your company that are dealing with that category of spend on a daily basis, they can very quickly root out, okay, did you just spend 45 minutes reading about this on Google so that you could come into this meeting? Or do you actually have some kind of legitimate knowledge that allows me to have a peer-to-peer conversation with you? It's a level of authenticity and knowledge that's impossible to fake. All right, Phil. So one of the things we promised when we started this conversation is that there was going to be at least something close to a 50-50 split in terms of asking questions and answering them. So I'm actually going to turn the tables on you a little bit here and ask about a post that you wrote this month about a recent executive order passed by the new governor's office in California. Do you want to give folks just a little bit of background in case they haven't seen the news or read the post?
Yeah, so it actually came as a little bit of a surprise to me. And California is close to my heart. As a lot of listeners will know, we lived there until quite recently when we moved cross-country. But the first day in office, the new governor of California essentially signed an executive order that signed into state law the idea of, this is a very high level, buying outcomes versus buying to specification. So it initiated a process called a request for innovative ideas, which was an RFI too, is in the parlance that they used. But really the idea of trying to get the best minds around a particular topic to come together to design an outcome and design how the external supply markets can help them solve a particular problem that they have, as opposed to just always issuing specifications. And it seems like, buying for outcomes versus buying for specifications is not necessarily something new. And actually, when I posted on about this on LinkedIn, I had a few comments about examples of where this happens and examples of where this happens on the federal government basis. But, those are for things like buying defense systems or buying aeroplanes, as opposed to perhaps solving some everyday challenges. So it was interesting to me that California and the new governor of California believed this so important that it was something that he would sign into an executive through an executive order the first day he was in office. But the fact that California is stepping up and really trying to codify the idea of buying for an outcome.
Now, one of the things that I actually took away, and I'm not from California, so I had to go do my own homework to be caught up on the idea. So it basically goes through sort of a more open sourcing process where at times representatives of the state of California are working with private sector experts, I believe is how they describe them, And then going out a little bit more open to suppliers. And there's, sort of a funnel that narrows down as you get closer, who has the better proposal, prototyping, demonstrations, that kind of thing. And one of the things that obviously anything that involves innovation is very exciting. Anything that allows suppliers to actually flex their muscles is very exciting. But it concerned me a little bit if I were a member of California's procurement team. It seemed to me to place an awful lot of emphasis on private sector expertise around defining the problem statement, whether it was around evaluating supplier proposals, whether it was working with those suppliers. And as we were just talking about category expertise, I'm curious in terms of how you read that from how does this sort of an initiative reshape the role, the influence, the qualifications of someone that's in procurement in the state of California.
Yeah, it's obviously going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the reality, because I think there's certainly a risk, or whether you see that as a risk or a benefit, depends on your perspective, but a risk for the bypassing of the procurement process. You could read into the executive order that it was, we don't think we're getting what we need by going through a traditional process, so this is going to be an exception process ultimately, and we're going to design a new way to have an exception process for traditional procurement. I think that, as in many things, and actually this ties in very nicely with what Joanna was talking about in her podcast, it depends on how you embrace this. So as a procurement professional within the state of California, you have the opportunity to be embracing and to actually be helping look for opportunities where you can implement a process like this and be proactive, and start to recognize your role in bringing suppliers in and basically being the coordination of all the different parties in an activity like this. Or you can see it as a risk and something where you're really trying to keep this out of your category because, you're afraid of what that might mean for your role within it. So I think there's a little bit of the unknown, but also it's a lot about how, as a procurement professional, you embrace it, because this can position procurement really well because you're starting to drive business outcomes versus being known for just trying to drive out cost. And I think that's one of our biggest issues, and has been, for the 20 years that I've been doing procurement, is how people perceive what we do.
Well, and it also brings us back to the human-to-human idea, because when you look at what's going to be required a little bit beyond the process that they describe, these industry experts are critical to the success of these innovation sprints. And so you could have an equally complicated process for selecting those experts. So I suppose part of what procurement's role becomes under this kind of a framework is either knowing the right people, or knowing how to find the right people, or knowing how to vet the people that you meet. And that gives you an amazing network of contacts, all these people that are industry experts, and to know more than one person for a focused period of time that all sort of focuses in the same domain. From a human learning and experience perspective, that is incredibly exciting, far more exciting, in fact, than spending all of your time trying to figure out what requirements and specifications should be for technology.
Yeah, I think an important role for procurement in something like this, and the California example, I think they've picked one or two projects as pilot programs for it, one within Cal Fire, and I forget what the other one was. But for procurement, it's being the people who know which are the right opportunities to pursue this kind of engagement. So you think about sourcing business models. So Kate Vitasek and her work at the University of Tennessee through Vested. Sourcing business models is about looking at a continuum of what is it we're trying to get out of a sorting event, what are the outcomes that we're trying to drive, and then looking at whether it's, we should undertake a transactional approach to sourcing, whether we should take a relational approach to sourcing, whether you should actually take more of an investment or a make approach to sourcing. So that's something that a role that procurement can play, is to help identify this is the one out of the 100 projects that it really makes sense to take this kind of approach for, and these are the reasons why, and then start to instigate them. If we're doing that, then we become there's a lot more kind of strategic thought that goes into that than just being told, hey, why don't you run that process for me? So I think that's a big opportunity. The other thing is just to think about this and I think about this always for outcome-based buying versus specification-based buying. It's really important not to use this just at a time when you don't have leverage. Because I think we fall into the trap of, okay, I don't really have leverage with this supplier, so then I'm going to be nice to them and see if being nice to them is a way of getting something that I couldn't get because because the balance of power in the relationship. So we do need to make sure we're disconnecting ourselves from any idea of power dynamics within a project where we're looking to buy for outcomes, and it's truly about what's the value that we're trying to drive, what's the opportunity for the business of engaging in this kind of way.
And I hope they share their results.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's fabulously successful, a huge failure, or most likely of all somewhere in the middle, it would be nice for the rest of us that are, I mean, I'm just excited someone's trying something different. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. But you get more out of figuring out where to incorporate components of this in your own process if you find out, okay, this worked, that didn't. Which part of it is because they're public sector versus private? How does that then factor into how we could take something that looks like this and use it to modify the right kinds of procurement projects at a large enterprise? I hope the story doesn't end here and we get to actually find out how it worked.
Yeah, time will tell. Something to keep our eye on for sure.
Absolutely.
So I want to finish off. We talked about covering a topic each month, and the one that we thought about this month, and actually we've alluded to a few different components of it already, I think, inadvertently through the discussion that we've had, is around storytelling. And the reason why we picked storytelling this month is that, we've gone through a process of revamping the website for Art of Procurement, and I know a number of people have been able to look at what the new website looks like. And as we've gone through that, we've really taken a step back to have a think about, how are we communicating what it is that we do, but how do we actually position it in a way that really makes sense for somebody who may be a prospect who's coming to the site, to understand how we help them. What is it, the fear that we help them overcome? And while I didn't want to talk about our website revamp, particularly in this section, what I do want to talk about is, how we position what we do, and we being procurement professionals, how do we position what we do to our stakeholders or to prospective stakeholders as we're trying to engage with people for the first time, especially when they may have a negative perception. Again, going back to something I just said before, a negative perception going in before we have that first conversation. So we're wanting to try and influence them to realize that we can provide a lot more value and help them kind of solve a lot more of their pain points than perhaps they realize.
Well, and it's interesting because I think truthfully, selling to procurement is one of the hardest things. Yeah. And so when you get in this situation, like Phil, you and I are, where in a way we still think of ourselves as procurement people, but to a certain extent, we're a little bit outside the circle now, right? So even if it's pitching our content to try to make sure that our full-time practitioner colleagues are reading it, to an extent, we are selling, air quotes, selling to procurement. And you have sort of these dual dialogues running in your head the whole time because you're thinking about, yes, I hate being sold to. I know what that feels like. I went through it for so many years, but I really, really want these people to read my content or listen to my podcast. And so I need to get out there and sell it. And it's interesting when you start thinking about telling a story, but not about yourself. Telling a story and remembering that, you exist, you work, you're going to, go on doing whatever. But what actually will make the difference at the end of the day is whether or not you can attract a following, an audience, customers, consumers, users, whatever the role happens to be, and keeping them at the center of the story. It's actually incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's so easy, and it's not because there's any particular ego involved in it.
No,
but it's really easy to talk about yourself and how you believe that you can help somebody, as opposed to putting them at the center of the conversation. And so as an example, you look at most of the websites for better or worse in our space, and we did it, you look at them and it's all about what features do they have, what can they do to help you? But then you bring that to, what's the relevance to me as a procurement professional? Well, think about the decks that you use to try and convince people to work with you. Whether it's a new spend that you're trying to get under management, more than likely those decks will talk about, this is what procurement is, this is how we help people, And these are some of the results that we've got. And here's somebody who's an advocate, if you want to go and speak to somebody else and get, and that's a natural flow to take somebody through to try and position yourself as, we can create value. But what we're missing is, what do the stakeholders need from us, or what's their fears that we can help them overcome, or opportunities that keep them up at night that we can help them take advantage of. And it's not, fulfilling a process mandate, or, checking a box because the policy says that they have to work with procurement. That's not the emotional tie that they will have that makes them want to work with you.
Well, and in a way, it allows us to skip a step because, people do need to understand what procurement does. But then before they decide to act or invest emotionally, they have to make the decision that what we do is good for them or furthers their objectives. Whereas if we can sit down, and the idea of what procurement does has to be in the conversation, but it doesn't need to be the lead. So if we can reposition the way we talk about and jump right ahead to the way we fulfill needs, the way we advance towards objectives, we're already sort of talking people through the inner monologue we want them to be having as they hear our words or as they leave the meeting. If we can just get that right out on the table and show them that, we understand, right? Mm-hmm. We're not just talking about what we like to do. We're looking at it from the perspective of what they're trying to accomplish. I think it has a way of more naturally aligning people and sort of facilitating the chance to work together.
Yeah, and it's all about building that personal connection again, so that they feel like you understand what their pain is, that you have a plan, so you can help them overcome the challenge or take advantage of the opportunity they may face, and they can trust you in actually being able to deliver it. And you want to communicate those things first before you ever really talk about, these are the things that we actually do, these are the tactics that we may fulfill. You really want to connect with what it is that they're trying to achieve first. And that's going to be different from a stakeholder to stakeholder. So you don't really, you think about segmentation, and we all do stakeholder segmentation, but how much do we actually take what we learn in that stakeholder segmentation and apply it to the way we communicate with those people? And I know from my perspective, it was something that, did I do it? If I did it, it was by chance, it wasn't by design. And so, this is about taking a little bit more of a strategic approach to having your communications with people based on, again, what their fears, what their needs are, and connecting what we do with those, as opposed to just kind of giving them the pitch of this is what we do.
And basing it on a relationship. I mean, back to the human connection idea, there needs to be, and maybe this is even the next level of looking at it, because it's not really about me. It's not about what procurement does. It's not 100% about you, because if it was just about you, you'd be at home, right? It's really about we and what, by joining objectives with expertise and tactics, we can accomplish together for the enterprise. It's actually a very complicated thing. Yeah.
So as we attempted to try and do it, you look at the homepage of our site and of the Art of Procurement site, and I'm actually just going there as we speak here. We start off by kind of painting a picture of what the stakeholder or what a prospect could actually achieve, by working with us. And, put your procurement hat on. It's what can they achieve by working with procurement? And then you start to drill down into, why is it that you're having difficulty achieving that today? Because it's kind of a trigger that helps somebody who's reading it say, yes, this is something that's important to me, or no, it isn't. But if it's something that's important, it compels you to want to know a little bit more, because it's a pain that they're feeling. But then it's about having empathy. Like, I understand what your pain is, because all these other peoples have the same issue. You're not alone in having these fears or having these challenges. We see it all the time. That's why we as a procurement as a procurement professional, can actually help you overcome it. And it's only then that you start to talk about the ways that you can help them overcome. One, by showing examples, and that's where you bring your advocates and your case studies into the conversation to say, look, we've helped other people like you overcome these challenges, and then this is the plan that we have to help you get there. And it can be a really flexible plan, but at least there's a plan so that they have confidence that you're actually able to deliver on some of the things that you say. And that's really what you want to be looking at your deck in terms of how you're pitching, to start to build that story with your stakeholder or with a potential stakeholder so that they can get a lot more confidence that you're not just here to run them a process, you're actually here to help them overcome the challenges that they want to overcome, and that you're a tool for them in doing that. So I know that we're running up against time. It's funny that Kelly and I, when we started the conversation, we were thinking, do we have enough content here to talk about? But, you get the two of us talking, and I think we managed to cover a lot of the topics that we wanted to. How do you feel about that, Kelly?
Oh my gosh. And I feel like for all my notes, there were a million things more we could have talked about. But hopefully this is enough of sort of a toe dip into each of the things that ran across Art of Procurement this month, to give people a sense not only of the big picture, but maybe which of the resources they might want to go back to if they haven't caught them yet.
Yeah, so we'd love to hear from you. What did you like? What did you not like? What could we do a little bit different? I think that this format of the show is going to evolve as we do more and more of them. We're planning on publishing this kind of show the last Monday of every single month. So I'd love to hear from you, and we can obviously take questions as well, and we can bring those questions into the podcast at the end of February. So with all that being said, it's time to wrap up. I do just want to say, just to follow up on the storytelling that we talked about before, if you would like us to take a look at the pitch decks that you are using with your stakeholders, Kelly and I would love, we have probably the ability to do 3 or 4 of them right now based on our schedules, but send us your pitch deck and we'll do a little bit of a critique and actually use some of the methodology that we've been using to start looking at our messaging and our communication, and just give you some feedback on if there's ways that we think that you could make tweaks that would really make your the communication, the presentation of what you do and your value proposition stronger to your stakeholders. Because ultimately that's what we want to do, is we want to help you to be able to have a bigger impact within your organization. I think this is an area where small changes can really make a big difference.
And if you're not clear on whether or not you have a pitch deck, because that's sort of a sales perspective, we want to hear that too. Let us know, because that can be sort of part of the ongoing conversation.
Yeah, it's really whatever you use when you're having a first conversation with a stakeholder or with a prospective stakeholder, and you're really wanting to, it may even be something that, hey, they have no choice but to come and use you, but the tone, you're going to set the tone in that first conversation of whether this is going to be a relationship where you're helping create kind of mutual value together, or whether it's a process where you're going to be helping them, check a few boxes. And how they see that interaction is really going to, I think, influence the level of collaboration that you have with that stakeholder. All right, well, that's it. Kelly, thank you very much for joining me.
So glad to be here.
Until next time, I hope you have a great month, and I'll be back with another interview next Monday. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.